We're spilling tea on religion and health, where intersections of faith and healing combine on religiosity. As this podcast discusses religious beliefs, religious experiences, personal testimonies, and mental and physical health, some of the content may be uncomfortable or triggering for some listeners. Content warnings will be provided in the description of each episode. Any personal journeys discussed on this podcast do not constitute health, medical, or religious advice. We are simply trying to capture the lived experiences of real people who would like to share their own stories about religion and/or health. This is your host, Adrian. This episode will be a bit different from the regularly planned format of this show. We urgently need to talk about religion in the United States government. On the U.S. court's government website relating to First Amendment protections for freedom of religion, we see a couple of issues and definitions. The first relates to the establishment of a state religion, while the other is the Free Exercise Clause. I will be reading verbatim what is stated on the website. These definitions are informed by the First Amendment and several court rulings that further explain the role of government in relation to an individual's ability to exercise their religion. It reads, "The First Amendment has two provisions concerning religion, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. The Establishment Clause prohibits the government from establishing a religion. The precise definition of establishment is unclear. Historically, it meant prohibiting state-sponsored churches, such as the Church of England. Today, what constitutes an establishment of religion is often governed under the three-part test set forth by the U.S. Supreme Court in Lemon v. Kurtzman. Under the Lemon test, government can assist religion only if the primary purpose of the assistance is secular. The assistance must neither promote nor inhibit religion, and there is no excessive entanglement between church and state. The Free Exercise Clause protects citizens' rights to practice their religion as they please, so long as the practice does not run afoul of public morals or a compelling governmental interest. For instance, in Prince v. Massachusetts, the Supreme Court held that a state could force the inoculation of children whose parents would not allow such action for religious reasons. The court held that the state had an overriding interest in protecting public health and safety. Sometimes the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause come into conflict. The federal courts help to resolve such conflicts, with the Supreme Court being the ultimate arbiter. It is important to note that the Bill of Rights gives us freedom of religion, and not freedom from religion, as we dive into our discussion today. On February 7th, 2025, President Trump signed an executive order to establish a White House Faith Office to assist faith-based organizations in the acquisition of funding to sponsor community development initiatives. On its face, an office like this could promote good change in community development through faith-based organizations and houses of worship. This follows a similar iteration from George W. Bush's Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives. The executive order states that the efforts of faith-based organizations and places of worship are essential to strengthening families and revitalizing communities. This language gives me my first pause in the interpretation of this piece of policy. Strengthening families and building robust community services to aid in development and addressing a slew of economic, health, and spiritual needs of communities sounds wonderful. However, with recent legislative pushes out of judicial jurisprudence and state legislative bodies to re-examine the state of gay marriage or marriage equality policy in the United States drives me to wonder what is meant here by strengthening families. Are the families strengthened by these initiatives supposed to include all families, no matter how different they look from the religiously prescribed nuclear family formation? Or is this covert language to provide a legislative avenue for renormalizing Christian ideals of what a family should look like at the federal level? With current attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in the federal government, the aforementioned attacks on LGBTQ+ civil liberties through the courts and state bodies, and with further language coming from the White House on centralizing God back into the national way of life, the apparently innocuous language of strengthening families takes on new connotations. Special attention should be paid during this time to how the language coming from the White House can be interpreted to the detriment of marginalized communities, and serious consideration needs to be taken into who will benefit from these initiatives. This executive order further discusses consultation from experts and various faith and community leaders, but goes on to explicitly mention addressing anti-Semitic, anti-Christian, and other anti-religious bias, including the promotion of foster care and adoption programs, and providing education. Including language in this order relating to foster care, adoption, and education through faith-based organizations is another area of pause for me. With a specific mention of Judaism and Christianity while lumping all other major world religions as other, centralizes the Abrahamic faiths, except Islam, in the activities that are being promoted by this order. With common rhetoric around the indoctrination of children from left-wing opponents, this order seems to be paving a path forward for the Christianization of children through the aforementioned foster care, adoption, and educational principles established by the order, regardless of those children's backgrounds. A little bit of an extreme example, but one that is valid, would be how this legislation applies to the Church of Satan or members of a Wiccan coven. Will these religious institutions be given the same opportunities to foster community development, foster and adopt children, and provide educational services to communities in need as Jewish and Christian congregations and communities? Don't get me wrong, although I don't subscribe to these mainstream religions, I am excited about work with faith-based organizations. I think a lot of people benefit from the intervention of trusted faith leadership more than they trust medical professionals. As such, these programs are important with supplying communities with health education, linking community members to social services and other resources, providing food pantries, interview closets where people can rent clothes for interviews, mental health care, substance use cessation services, and more. These initiatives are historic and dynamic in providing for the actual needs of community members and shouldn't be laughed off. Initiatives like this should be allowed to receive funding to assist their communities. This is the kind of work I see myself doing in the future, and this is the kind of work that gets me genuinely excited. However, with the language of this order, I have to critically wonder about what the intentions behind it are and how it will impact the communities who need these services the most. If most of the allowable funding goes to mainstream religions, they can serve a wide percentage of the population, but then it drives people toward engagement in that particular branch of faith. It is suggesting the use of federal funds to encourage participation in specific religious denominations rather than other social interventionist strategies that are secular. It is also likely that the various other faiths excluded from specific mention in this order will also receive partial or no benefit from the proposed programming. It is worth reading the entire order for yourself. The link will be listed in the show notes. The last piece of this order I want to discuss is under Section 4, subsections 10 and 11, which read, "Work in collaboration with the Attorney General or a designee of the Attorney General to identify concerns raised by faith-based entities, community organizations, and houses of worship about any failures of the executive branch to enforce constitutional and federal statutory protections for religious liberty, and identify and propose means to reduce burdens on the free exercise of religion, including legislative, regulatory, and other barriers to the full and active participation of faith-based entities, community organizations, and houses of worship in government-funded or government-conducted activities and programs." Religious liberty is a core tenet of the American democracy. This country was originally founded as a colony by people escaping religious persecution, so ideas of faith and the freedom to choose what we believe is intrinsic to the core of American history. It is a noble effort at face value to protect the freedom of religion and to allow people free exercise of their religion. While religious organizations can seek funding from the government to support community-based interventions or programs, I think it is important to remember the Establishment Clause. The government cannot impose a religion or the tenets of that religion on the people through virtue of the religion itself. While it is true, "thou shalt not kill" is one of the 10 commandments, and societies by and large promote the idea of not killing each other, the morality of this sentiment is not intrinsically baked into one religion or another, but rather a commitment made across various cultures and societies across time to uphold each other's well-being and livelihood, regardless of the actual faith used as a vehicle to deliver that message. For example, similar messaging is found in Buddhism, which predates Christianity by 500 years. Further, by virtue of the free exercise clause, which this order is trying to inspect, religious ideology cannot impact the public interest in relation to government functioning. Yes, you are free to practice your religion and your faith. However, everyone else is free to practice their own faith as well, simultaneous to your right to do so. The overlap in these differing opinions about how we ought to act and behave happens every day as we all interact and engage with one another. And if you don't agree with the quote-unquote lifestyle of others, you do not have to engage with those people on a personal level. However, when it comes to the functions of government, you are no longer acting as an agent of your own free will, but rather temporarily giving up that agency while on government time and payroll to act as a servant to the public. The public will always include people you fundamentally disagree with, and yet it is the duty of the government and its actors, both big-name policymakers to unknown but important civil servants, to serve that public regardless of who it actually includes. That is at least my understanding of the free exercise clause. You are perfectly able to hold your own beliefs, but that does not give you the right to impose those beliefs on those around you as part of your role in civil service. Why do I bring this up? Well, on February 6th, 2025, President Trump signed an executive order on the eradication of anti-Christian bias. The purpose of the executive order reads, "It is the policy of the United States and the purpose of this order to protect the religious freedoms of Americans and end the anti-Christian weaponization of government. The founders established a nation in which people were free to practice their faith without fear of discrimination or retaliation by their government." This order uses examples of anti-abortion protester arrests and FBI investigation into the Catholic faith and attacks on faith-based organizations that were left uninvestigated by the Biden administration. While these cases can stand on their own merit as being worthy of further investigation into their propriety and rectifying injustice, if it did indeed occur, these arguments are a preface for anti-transgender language. The order reads, "The Biden Equal Employment Opportunity Commission sought to force Christians to affirm radical transgender ideology against their faith. And the Biden Department of Health and Human Services sought to drive Christians who do not conform to certain beliefs on sexual orientation and gender identity out of the foster care system." This is the piece I want to focus on since it specifically mentions the healthcare needs of transgender individuals and HHS views on sexual and gender minorities. Again, it is worth reading the entire order for yourself. This executive order on eradicating anti-Christian bias seeks to set up a task force to investigate a variety of concerns held by the administration. The listed priorities of the task force under Section 3 of the executive order are as follows: to review the activities of all executive departments and agencies, including the Department of State, the Department of Justice, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Department of Labor, the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Education, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission over the previous administration and identify any unlawful anti-Christian policies, practices, or conduct by an agency contrary to the purpose and policy of this order. To recommend to the head of the relevant agency steps to revoke or terminate any violative policies, practices, or conduct identified under subsection 3A1 of this section, and remedial actions to fulfill the purpose and policy of this order. To share information and develop strategies to protect the religious liberties of Americans and advance the purpose and policy of this order. to solicit information and ideas from a broad range of individuals and groups, including Americans affected by anti-Christian conduct, faith-based organizations, and state, local, and tribal governments, in order to ensure that its work is informed by a broad spectrum of ideas and experiences. To identify deficiencies in existing laws and enforcement and regulatory practices that have contributed to unlawful, anti-Christian governmental or private conduct, and recommend to the relevant agency head or recommend to the President, through the Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy and the Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy, as applicable, appropriate actions that agencies may take to remedy failures to fully enforce the law against acts of anti-Christian hostility, vandalism, and violence, and, finally, to recommend to the President through the Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy and the Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy any additional presidential or legislative action necessary to rectify past improper anti-Christian conduct, protect religious liberty, or otherwise fulfill the purpose and policy of this order. Some of the alarming language from the task force priorities include reviewing the activities of the executive departments and agencies, including HHS, for unlawful anti-Christian policies, to recommend to agencies to revoke or terminate policies that violate this order, to identify deficiencies in existing laws and enforcement to combat anti-Christian bias in government or private conduct, and to suggest legislative action relating to these issues. Did you catch that? To combat anti-Christian bias in government or private conduct. It is unclear at this time who the private conduct refers to, but it can certainly be applied to the federal workforce. Further, what is meant by anti-Christian bias in the context of this order? In prior language from this very order, anti-Christian bias can be interpreted as including in its meaning the forceful indoctrination of gender ideology or sexual minority status acceptance on employees of the government. This rhetoric and policies around these ideas are harmful. First and foremost, being transgender or being gay, lesbian, bisexual, or any other sexual minority may violate some religious tenets. However, these identities are not founded in a religious context. They are social identities that occur regardless of faith affiliation or the lack thereof. Therefore, the policies in place that protect the availability of and access to health services provided by the government to all people, including transgender, gay, lesbian, or bisexual people, are social policies and not religious policies. This means that it is not an imposition of religion or faith that says we have to provide care for these people, regardless of what our own faith says. This is also not anti-Christian. You are allowed to be Christian. You do not have to associate with transgender, gay, lesbian, or bisexual people in your personal life. Though, let me tell you, you're missing out if you don't. However, by virtue of both the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause of religious freedom, you cannot act as a public servant and in doing so refuse services to people because they are not aligned with your ideas of right and wrong. That is actually using your religion to obstruct the rights of others. That is discrimination. Worth noting, the specific mention of sexual minorities here alludes to future rhetoric centered around the LGBTQ+ community rather than the early focus on just transgender individuals. I've known it from the start, but we are all an object of attention on the national stage right now. I also hate to be the one to break this news, but apparently not everyone's received the memo. LGBTQ+ people are religious too. Maybe not Christian, but many also are Christian. They may not subscribe to your particular brand of Christianity, or they may have made tough decisions to live their truth despite what the doctrine says. That doesn't make their faith any less real or any less valid. I have a Christian friend who says, "We all fall short of the grace of God." Let that sink in. Why is our sin so much bigger than the countless sins you commit every day? Why are our sins the ones where you draw the line? You don't have to be gay. You don't have to be transgender. You don't have to affirm personally the LGBTQ plus community. You also don't have to judge. You don't have to be angry or even have to care. But if you chose to be a public servant, you do have to do your job. You have to serve the public. All members of the public, regardless of whether or not they subscribe to your religious beliefs or not. Regardless of if this person is someone you would be friends with or say hello to on the street. Doing your job and serving all members of the public is not anti-Christian bias. It is not an attack on your ability to be Christian on your own time. Choosing to use your faith to discriminate against others is, however, a violation of the establishment and free exercise clauses. I hope in the future we can get funding for faith-based organizations that are open to DEI. I hope in the future we can put our differences aside in the interest of public good. I hope we can continue to abstain from letting religious doctrine guide our political decisions, and I hope all people can get access to the care they need, the care they want, and to care that is sensitive, holistic, and comfortable to meet all of their needs. Whether you're a good Christian living in the Bible Belt, or whether you're a radical atheist in some metropolis, I hope we all can live a life worth living, explore each other's worldviews, and learn to live together for mutual benefit. And that's the religiosity. Please keep an eye on the legislation coming out relating to this issue. Please contact your representatives and senators. Please vote in the midterm elections. We all deserve to have our stakes known and where we stand on these issues. Until next time, be happy, be healthy, and be well.